We're going to look at the cross-price elasticity of demand. Cross-price elasticity of demand looks at the relationship between two goods. So when we're looking at how consumers change their buying habits when the price of one good goes up, what happens to the demand or the quantity demanded of the other good, meaning the substitute or the complement? So for the formula, we'll look at the percent change in quantity demanded of good X when there is a percent change in the price of good Y. So for cross-price elasticity, we call this elasticity of X and Y. Okay, every book calls it something a little different. You might see it as the ED, elasticity of demand for good X and Y, but this seems to be the most common way to write it. So basically, if we're comparing two goods, if the price of one good goes up, if we have, let's say, an increase in the price of good X, and this leads to an increase in the demand of good Y, so they're buying a higher quantity demanded of good Y, these are going to have a positive relationship, so we'll see that the cross-price elasticity is going to be a positive number. Okay, anytime that we end up with a positive cross-price elasticity, these are going to be substitutes. Okay, now if the price of good Y goes up, and that causes consumers to buy less of good Y, that means that the cross-price elasticity is obviously a negative, because you'd have a positive. You'd have a positive down here on the bottom, a negative divided by a positive, which is going to give you a negative number. That's going to give us a negative number. So that means that these are going to be our complementary goods. So let's take a look at this. So if the price of Pepsi goes up, people are going to buy less quantity demanded of Pepsi and shift their demand preferences to increase their demand for Coke. If the price of hot dogs goes up, people are going to be buying smaller amounts of hot dogs, therefore they will need less demand for hot dog buns. Okay, so cross-price elasticities for this continuum, we would see that we have three different options. We could have the cross-price elasticity equal to 0. We could have the cross-price elasticity we could just say that it's going to be greater than 0, or we could have the cross-price elasticity where it's going to be less than 0. Those are our three options. So here, right in the middle, this would be two goods that are unrelated. Okay, so these are unrelated goods. Okay, if the price of cell phone goes up, the amount of drinking water that I'm demanding isn't going to change. Okay, so there's not a relationship between there. Over here, when the cross-price elasticity is a negative good, these are obviously our complements. And over here, where it's positive cross-price elasticity, these are our substitutes. Now, the larger the number in real terms, the closer the substitute or the complement. So over here, if we have a good or service that's, has a cross-price elasticity of 0.5, what that tells us is that the two goods are substitutes, and for every 1% increase in price, it's going to cause a 0.5% increase in demand of the other good. Okay, so they're substitutes, they're not super close substitutes. If we see that the cross-price elasticity of demand is something like 2, that means if there's a 1% increase in the price of Y, it's going to lead to a 2% increase in the price of good X. So that means that if there's a 10% increase in the price of good Y, it's going to lead to a 20% increase in the quantity demanded of good X. Okay, So these two goods are definitely close substitutes, or very close substitutes. We can see things all the way down to perfect substitutes. Perfect substitutes are two goods where the consumer is completely indifferent between the two. Perfect complements are probably a little bit harder to think about. Peanut butter and jelly are very high complementary relationship. The correlation between those two is very high. Bread and mayonnaise, mustard, something like that, mayonnaise and mustard, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every time you buy mayonnaise, you buy mustard. So complements and substitutes, the degree of correlation tells us how strong of substitutes or how strong of complements they are. There are quite a few examples of this in the workbook. Make sure that you look at the mathematical application behind the cross-price elasticity. Okay, up next we'll take a tiny look at the elasticity of supply. Elasticity of demand, there are so many more things that go into it than the elasticity of supply, but we'll take a little look at the elasticity of supply, and I think your book spends maybe 2 pages on this, where the entire rest of the chapter is devoted to elasticity of demand.